Hi, good evening and welcome. It's always great again to partner with both the network and with IGDS on bringing these issues of gender and sexuality together. Um, Allies for Justice and Diversity came together as an umbrella of the six LGBTI organizations that have developed in Trinidad and Tobago, five of them since 2009 when Marlene MacDonald indicated that sexual orientation would not be part of her government's gender policy. And that gender policy, as we know it, is now, well, the plans to make that gender policy is part of the PNM's manifesto, which was adopted by the cabinet as policy. Um, the night before the 2010 election, I thought I was hearing voices because I could swear I'd heard the word sexual orientation, but it was my mother. And it couldn't have been the TV because I looked and there was Elections and Boundaries Commission Chair Norbert Masson with the same get out the vote speech about the supreme power of the voter, but it was him. In his invocation about who a government represents without fear of distinction, he added to the list of race, ethnicity, the usual things, sexual orientation. Didn't do it again this year. He talked about other things. Even in the 2010 election, LGBTI issues arose in some unimagined ways. A media worker was grilling the same Marlene MacDonald, the PNM's gender minister, about the same gender policy and the same issue, sexual orientation, and the gender minister waffled about the issue being controversial. The media worker snapped back, it's a human rights issue, and cut her off. In that same campaign, a few of us ran into Verna St. Rose Graves coming out of the Gael studio and talked about the importance of raising sexual orientation and gender identity issues on the UNC's platform. And she asked, why do you want that done? And we said, so young people can hear. She got in her then famous small yellow car, drove directly to the rally, and raised them. That same evening, McCandle Daga, and if folks remember the 2010 campaign, there was a period where he would go into crescendo. He did that and erupted about, I think it was on the same night, about our schools producing homosexuals. Just before Patrick Manning actually sent Parliament home and called the election, groups from the month-old CAISO were meeting and talking about how we would engage with the election and decided to come up with a manifesto, which we then called 6 and 6. There were 6 things that we thought a government could realistically do in its first 6 months of existence. Well, I think the government achieved one of them very early in the election and none others after that. For the past 5 years, LGBT advocates have focused policy messages on 3 things in media and public discourse: discrimination protections in the Equal Opportunity Act, school climate issues. The Silver Lining Foundation has championed that, and the lack of political leadership around all sorts of LGBTI issues. Most recently, we started talking about the Children's Act. But it was same-sex marriage and decriminalization that the media itself raised in this campaign, sort of rolled into the same question as decriminalization of marijuana and raised this issue for the major parties. And many of you, and we'll talk certainly on the panel about what some of the responses were. But in May, prior to that, electoral history was actually made in the Caribbean when both major party groups in the Guyanese election included sexual orientation planks in their manifestos. The People's Partnership did the same, but from the campaign rhetoric that ensued, you wouldn't know that because all major parties competing framed that the rights of LGBTI people depended on the consent of a majority, and hopefully we'll talk much more about that. In my Trinidad Guardian column on the eve of the election, I claimed that there was no meaningful distinction for LGBTI people among the different parties, and I actually voted by writing LGBTI issues in the X section of my ballot. But I also commented that the ways in which activism happens by LGBTI people within parties looks remarkably different. And I actually commented that within the PNM, LGBTI people are ineffectual, whereas in the partnership parties, particularly the UNC and the COP, the issues have been vigorously raised by people who belong to those parties. Homophobia and campaign innuendo are not a new thing, but they arose in some interesting ways in this year's campaign when the only two candidates in a single race were both targets of gay name calling. And when gender jokes about the masculinity of male candidates were raised by people who said, I support LGBTI rights. What does that mean? And of course, what was most unimaginable of all were allegations about the sexuality of a sitting prime minister being covered by mainstream media. In 2010, when we first began to raise issues of who, with LGBTI people around, engaging with the election, they told us, none of the parties are going to take these issues seriously. I'm voting race. So what do LGBTI people vote for, and how ought we to vote? Do we vote on issues, or do we hold each party that we commit ourselves to accountable for moving the same set of issues forward? The coalition advocating for inclusion of sexual orientation, whose name reflects our origins in our exclusion from the gender policy, the Silver Lining Foundation, I Am One, Friends for Life, which is the oldest LGBTI group, Cara Flags, the Caribbean Forum for Liberation and Acceptance of Genders and Sexualities, which is a regional network that CAISO has helped anchor, came together over the course of the last couple of months under the umbrella of Allies for Justice and Diversity to think about what were the core issues that we wanted to call politicians' attention to cut across the noise that media was raising about what ought to be debated during the electoral campaign. It was a historic election in many ways, despite my dismissal of the differences between the parties. We had a transgender candidate who, in announcing her candidacy, playfully, in responding to the media's prurient interest around a gender identity, when she won a national award, said, "You think that's funny? I'm running for office." And in addition to the partnership's inclusion of sexual orientation in its manifesto, which is historic, there were these interesting markers in the campaign, and it'll be fascinating for me to hear in the discourse how they reflect how women's issues have played out and broader questions of gender throughout the course of the campaign. And I definitely look forward on behalf of the groups in Allies for Justice and Diversity to the exchange of the discussion, and thank you all for being here.